July 7th, 1944, 2:30 in the afternoon. The sun hangs heavy and white in the Normandy sky, baking the very air, which is thick not with the sweet scent of the French countryside, but with the suffocating, metallic tang of blood, the bitter perfume of cordite, and the greasy odor of diesel fumes. For a month since the Allied landings on D-Day, the advance has been a brutal, soul-crushing affair. The enemy is not just the German soldier, dug in with the fanatical tenacity of a cornered animal. The enemy is the land itself. An ancient, formidable obstacle that has turned this corner of France into a verdant slaughterhouse, the bocage. For the men of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, and for every American soldier fighting in this sector, the world has shrunk. It is no longer a map of France, but an endless, suffocating series of green boxes. They are trapped. Not in a classic military pocket, not by a grand encirclement, but by 1,000 years of French agriculture. They are imprisoned by the hedgerows. These are not the manicured hedges of an English garden or a suburban American home. They are titanic earthen walls, some rising 15 feet high and spanning 10 feet thick at the base. They are colossal embankments, packed earth, held together by the gnarled, interlocking root systems of ancient trees, hawthorn and bramble, woven together over centuries into a barrier as impenetrable as medieval ramparts. Each field, bordered by these green fortresses, is a self-contained killing box. And inside these boxes, the Germans have perfected the art of the ambush. Machine gun nests, like the dreaded MG-42, are dug into the earthen banks, perfectly concealed, their fields of fire pre-sighted to cover every possible entry point. Mortar teams are zeroed in on the center of the fields, and lurking in the shadows are teams of determined soldiers armed with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks, portable rocket launchers that can turn an American tank into a flaming coffin. For the American tankers, the hedgerows are a nightmare made real. Their M4 Sherman tanks, the workhorse of the U.S. Army, were designed for the fluid, mobile warfare envisioned for the plains of Europe. Here, in this claustrophobic labyrinth, they are worse than useless. They are death traps. The doctrine is simple and suicidal. The tankers can try to drive over the hedgerow. As the Sherman claws its way up the embankment, its thinly armored underbelly is exposed, hanging in the air for a fatal second, a perfect, stationary target for a waiting Panzerfaust team. It's a death sentence. The alternative is to try and smash through the base of the hedgerow. But the ancient roots and packed earth hold firm. The tank's tracks spin uselessly, digging into the soft soil, the engine screaming as the vehicle becomes hopelessly stuck, a sitting duck for every anti-tank gun within 1,000 yards. The only approved method is for the combat engineers to go first. These brave men, armed with satchel charges and courage, have to crawl forward under a hail of machine gun fire, find a spot, plant their explosives, and pray they can get back to cover before the fuse runs out. If they succeed, they blow a small gap in the hedgerow. Then the Sherman must race through that gap before the Germans can zero in on the breach. The cost of this stratagem is measured in dozens of lives for every 100 yards gained. The advance has slowed to a bloody crawl, an agonizing inch-by-inch battle of attrition. Morale, the spiritual fuel of any army, is beginning to run dangerously low. The casualty reports from the preceding days are a litany of horror, with companies losing 10, 15, 20 men to gain a single field.
The official order, the unwavering doctrine from high command, echoes down the chain from General Bradley to the corps commanders, to the division, and finally to every beleaguered unit on the line. It is unambiguous. Proceed as planned. Engineers will clear obstacles. Armor will support infantry advances through established gaps. Maintain pressure on the enemy. This is the doctrine. This is the protocol. It is the textbook solution from a textbook that was written for a different war, a different landscape. To the men getting torn apart in the bocage, it is a recipe for annihilation. In the relative quiet of the maintenance section of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey named Curtis Culin III listens to the grinding sounds of his mechanics trying to patch up yet another Sherman that has been chewed up by the hedgerows. He hears the distant, rhythmic crackle of an MG-42, a sound the GIs have nicknamed Hitler's Baw Saw. He sees the vacant, 1,000-yard stares in the eyes of the young tankers who have survived another patrol. They are boys who should be fixing cars and going to dances, and instead they are living with the constant, gnawing fear of being burned alive inside a steel box. And Sergeant Culin looks at the tools of his trade, laid out on a dirty canvas tarp. A welding torch, its hoses coiled like a sleeping snake. A pile of useless scrap steel, scavenged from a German roadblock the engineers had cleared a week ago. And in his mind, an idea is taking shape. It is a dangerous idea, an act of mechanical heresy. An idea that is not just unorthodox, it is a direct and flagrant violation of military protocol. To take a multi-ton piece of U.S. Army property, a complex machine of war, and modify its fundamental design without authorization, without blueprints, without a sheaf of signed papers from the Ordnance Department, was a court-martial offense. It was tampering with government equipment in a combat zone, an act that could land him in a military prison like Leavenworth. But to Sergeant Culin, the official plan was no longer a plan. It was a suicide pact written in the blood of his friends. As he picked up a jagged, V-shaped piece of German steel, a discarded caltrop from a Czech hedgehog obstacle, a quiet, defiant decision crystallized in the grease and sweat-filled air of his workshop. He wasn't going to follow the orders that were getting his friends killed. He was going to rewrite them, with a welding torch and an act of mechanical rebellion that would either save the American army in Normandy or end his career in disgrace. He flicked the striker, and with a sharp hiss, the acetylene torch roared to life, a small, brilliant blue flame against the encroaching darkness. To understand the mind that would dare to challenge the monolithic wisdom of the U.S. Army, to risk imprisonment for an unproven theory, you must first travel back from the blood-soaked fields of Normandy to the quiet streets of Cranford, New Jersey. Curtis Culin III was not a product of West Point, nor was he a seasoned military strategist steeped in the theories of Clausewitz. Before the war, he was a salesman for a local garage, a personable young man who knew his way around a customer. But his title was a misnomer. His true passion, the world he inhabited since he was a boy, was the world of gears, grease, and the elegant, powerful logic of the internal combustion engine. He was a born mechanic, a natural tinkerer. His father's garage was his true school. He didn't just see a machine, he saw a system, a puzzle of interlocking parts, and he possessed an innate, almost intuitive understanding of stress, torque, and leverage. He was one of those rare individuals who could diagnose an engine's ailment not just by sound, but by feel, by the very vibration it sent through the concrete floor. This wasn't a skill learned from a manual. It was a language he understood. He wasn't an officer. a man whose job was to look at maps and maneuver abstract symbols representing divisions and regiments. He was a sergeant, a non-commissioned officer, the vital link between the grand strategies and the gritty reality. His world was the mud, the metal, the smell of hydraulic fluid, and the lives of the men who depended on his expertise to keep their machines running, to keep them alive. This identity, this intimate, hands-on connection to the very steel that was failing in the fields of Normandy, was the seed of his genius. He wasn't trying to out-general the enemy. He was trying to solve a mechanical problem. The problem was the hedgerow. The victims were his friends. The larger strategic context was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion for the Allied High Command. The invasion, so spectacularly successful on the beaches of D-Day, was now dangerously close to bogging down, threatening a stalemate reminiscent of the Western Front in World War I. The Allied plan, codenamed Operation Cobra, was a massive, ambitious offensive designed to be the breakout blow. It was conceived by the quiet, methodical General Omar Bradley as a thunderous punch that would shatter the German front lines west of Saint-Lô. The plan involved a colossal aerial bombardment by thousands of heavy bombers to pulverize the German front lines, creating a hole through which the armored divisions of General J. Lawton Collins' 7th Corps, spearheaded by the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, could pour. Once through the breach, they were to be unleashed with General George S. Patton's newly activated 3rd Army right behind them to race across the open country of France. But Operation Cobra depended entirely on speed, shock, and mobility, the three things the bocage made impossible. The primary German adversary in this sector was the highly disciplined and battle-hardened Panzerlehr Division, an elite armored formation supplemented by battle groups from other divisions, including elements of the fanatical 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. These were not conscripts. They were seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front, masters of defensive warfare, who had expertly turned the ancient agricultural landscape into a deep, layered, and deadly defensive web. Every hedgerow was a trench line, every sunken lane a potential anti-tank ditch. The Grand Offensive, scheduled to begin in late July, was at risk of failing before it even began, choked by the impassable terrain that was bleeding the Allied forces white.
Sergeant Culin's immediate world was the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, attached to the 2nd Armored Division. His job was to keep their M5 Stewart light tanks and M8 Greyhound armored cars operational. His crew was a small, tight-knit collection of men just like him, ordinary Americans thrust into extraordinary circumstances. There was Technician 5th Grade William Bill Bowl, a fellow mechanic from a neighboring town in New Jersey, a man who was more cautious than Culin, who understood the regulations they were about to break, but whose loyalty to his sergeant and his frustration with the daily carnage overrode his fear of the consequences. And there was Private First Class Nicholas Gaggy, a young soldier from rural Tennessee. Gaggy wasn't a mechanic, but he had grown up on a farm, and he possessed a different kind of mechanical knowledge, the knowledge of the land, of stubborn roots and unyielding soil. They were surrounded by drivers, gunners, and radio operators, young men from Ohio, Texas, and New York, who had been trained for a war of movement and dash, and instead found themselves fighting a bloody, claustrophobic battle of attrition against an unyielding landscape. The situation was growing desperate by the day, by the hour. Just the day before, Culin's unit had listened over the radio to a doomed attack by a company from the 30th Infantry Division. The familiar, sickening narrative unfolded in clipped, static-filled transmissions. Able Company, moving forward, approaching the hedgerow line. A pause filled only by the crackle of the ether. Then the frantic voice of a platoon leader. Taking heavy fire from concealed positions in the hedgerow, machine guns at 3 o'clock. Another voice, a tanker. Tank 3 is trying to go over. He's hung up. He's stuck. Then a different, more panicked voice. He's hit. Tank 3 is hit. Oh God, it's brewing up. The radio fell silent.
High Command's response, when it came, was chillingly detached. Maintain pressure. Await engineer support. But the engineers were pinned down, dying just as fast as the infantry. The official plan had met the brutal reality of the bocage, and the plan was breaking, shattering against the ancient earthen walls. For Sergeant Curtis Culin, listening to the silence on the radio and looking at the mangled steel of a failed offensive, it was clear that waiting for an order wasn't an option. The solution wouldn't come from a general's map table miles behind the lines. It would have to be forged here, in the field, from scrap iron, ingenuity, and sheer desperation.
The genesis of the solution was not a lightning bolt of inspiration in the solitude of a workshop. It was a simple conversation, born of shared frustration and the universal language of men at war searching for an edge. Culin was standing with Private Nicholas Gaggy, the boy from Tennessee, looking at another Sherman tank that had been recovered, its belly armor peppered with shrapnel from where it had been hit after getting stuck on a hedgerow. They were lamenting the futility of it all, the sheer grinding waste. Gaggy, kicking at the dirt, made an offhand remark. He said something to the effect of, "Back home, if you had a big old stump you needed to clear, you wouldn't try to push it over. You'd get the plow and tear its roots right out of the ground." He spoke of how a simple farm plow, if it was sharp and strong enough, could slice through the earth and sever the roots that gave the stump its strength. The conversation was casual, a moment of commiseration between a city mechanic and a country boy. But for Curtis Culin, a switch was thrown in the intricate machinery of his mind. He stopped seeing a 15-foot wall of earth and trees. He started seeing a root system. And in that moment, he understood the fundamental flaw in the American approach. They were treating the hedgerow as a wall to be battered down with brute force. Gaggy's simple analogy reframed the problem entirely. To defeat it, you didn't need more force. You needed a tooth, a sharp, powerful tooth that could get underneath the problem and attack its foundation. His eyes, scanning the maintenance yard, fell again upon the pile of German scrap metal his unit had collected. His gaze fixed on the remnants of several Czech hedgehogs. These were massive anti-tank obstacles forged from 3 intersecting steel rails designed by the Germans to stop vehicles cold on roads and beaches. They were symbols of enemy defiance. Culin saw something else. He saw a ready-made set of colossal steel teeth. The aha moment was brutally simple, a fusion of Gaggy's agricultural insight and his own mechanical expertise. What if he could take the enemy's own obstacles and turn them into a key? What if he could cut them apart and weld them to the front of a Sherman tank, not to smash the hedgerow, but to cut through it? His idea was to create a set of massive, downward-angled steel tusks, a kind of armored plow that would strike the hedgerow at its base. These tusks would slice through the earth and tear up the thick, interlocking roots, allowing the tank's own immense weight and power to push the entire earthen wall up and away from it, all while keeping the vulnerable belly armor completely protected. Without asking for permission, knowing that a request for such a radical modification sent up the chain of command would be lost in a labyrinth of bureaucratic limbo for weeks, if it was ever seen at all, Culin went to work. He gathered his trusted mechanic, Bill Bowl, and a few others. He laid out his plan. Bowl, ever the pragmatist, immediately saw the risks, not just to their careers, but to the tank itself. An improper weld could crack. The stress on the transmission could be catastrophic. But looking at Culin's determined face and thinking of the burning tank on the radio, he picked up a cutting torch. The execution was a masterpiece of battlefield improvisation. There were no blueprints, no schematics from the Ordnance Department. This was engineering guided by instinct. They used a power generator to run their welding and cutting equipment, often working at night to avoid the prying eyes of visiting officers. First, they had to cut the Czech hedgehogs apart.
This was hardened German steel designed to withstand immense punishment, and had fought them every inch of the way, showering the workshop in a cascade of brilliant orange sparks. They experimented with the angle and the length of the tusks. The first design was crude, almost primeval. They welded these immense steel teeth directly to the bottom front of an M4 Sherman. The welds had to be perfect, strong enough to withstand the unimaginable force of 30 tons of steel hitting a wall of earth. Their first test was an informal, nerve-wracking affair. They found an M4A1 tank that was slated for major repairs and chose a quiet sector, away from the main line. The driver, a young corporal who trusted Culin implicitly, aimed the newly modified tank, which now looked like some kind of prehistoric armored beast, at a formidable hedgerow that had previously stopped another vehicle cold. He revved the right Continental engine, the tank shuddering with power. He put it in gear and drove forward, not at full speed, but with steady, relentless momentum. The effect was immediate, astonishing, and violent. Instead of riding up the embankment, the steel tusks dug deep into the base of the earthen wall. There was a tremendous deep groan of tortured roots being ripped from the earth, a sound of geological trauma. The entire 30-ton tank shuddered, its tracks digging in and finding purchase. Then, with a final, explosive heave, the Sherman ripped a massive, gaping hole straight through the hedgerow, emerging on the other side in a shower of dirt, rocks, and shredded foliage, its main 75mm gun already level and traversing, ready to fire. It didn't just breach the obstacle, it had annihilated it, creating its own portable doorway through the German defenses. The psychological impact on the few German soldiers who may have witnessed these early clandestine tests from a distant observation post would have been profound. Their greatest defensive asset, the very earth of France, had just been rendered obsolete by a 30-ton steel plow. A Sherman tank, which they knew to be vulnerable and clumsy in the bocage, was suddenly behaving in a way that defied all their combat experience. It didn't pause, it didn't wait for sappers, it didn't clumsily expose itself. It simply appeared as if from nowhere, tearing through a wall they had considered impenetrable. This wasn't just a new tactic, it was a violation of the established rules of this battlefield. The initial German reaction would have been one of stunned confusion, perhaps even a sliver of superstitious fear. Was this a new, secret weapon? A specialized pioneer vehicle they hadn't been briefed on? This momentary hesitation, this seed of doubt planted in the mind of the enemy, was precisely the advantage the Americans so desperately needed. Word of the hedge cutter spread like wildfire through the lower ranks, a whispered rumor of hope. A few junior officers saw the device in action and immediately grasped its revolutionary potential. The controlled collapse of the hedgerow defenses was now theoretically possible. Instead of a slow, costly, and telegraphed breach at a single point, a whole platoon of these modified tanks could advance on a broad front, ripping through the bocage at will, maintaining the precious momentum of an attack and overwhelming the defenders before they could react. The legend of the Rhino tank, as it was soon nicknamed for its formidable tusks, began to circulate. Captured German soldiers, interrogated after later engagements involving the Rhinos, would speak of American tanks that could suddenly drive through the ground, seeming to materialize out of nowhere. Their reports were often confused and exaggerated, creating the impression of a much larger, more powerful, and technologically advanced force than was actually present. Cullen's unauthorized welding job hadn't just created a tool, it had created a ghost, a psychological weapon that struck at the very heart of the German defensive strategy and gave the American GI a desperately needed boost in morale. The first people to truly understand the magnitude of what Sergeant Culin had done were not generals poring over maps in a distant chateau, but the infantrymen and tankers who were slated to die in the next futile push. A young first lieutenant from the 29th Infantry Division, a unit that had been bled white in the hedgerows since Omaha Beach, witnessed an early demonstration. He watched, jaw agape, as the Rhino tank effortlessly tore through a hedgerow that had cost his company 6 men and 2 machine gun teams the day before. He reportedly sought out Culin afterward. He didn't offer a medal or a formal commendation. He just grabbed the grease-stained sergeant's hand, shook it firmly, and said with the dead serious sincerity of a man who had seen too much death, "I don't know who you are, Sergeant, but you just saved the lives of half my company." This was the first and perhaps most meaningful validation, the unvarnished recognition from the men on the front line. They saw the Culin Rhino device, as it was beginning to be called, not as a breach of protocol, but as a lifeline, a tangible answer to their prayers. Inevitably, however, the invention that was the talk of the front lines reached the ears of the rear echelon, and the official reckoning arrived. Culin was summoned to a debriefing with a senior officer from the Ordnance Department, a colonel whose name is lost to history, but whose role was clear. He was the voice of the establishment. The mood in the tent was not celebratory, it was tense, accusatory. This officer, a man who lived by the holy scriptures of blueprints, regulations, and authorized procedures, saw not a solution, but a violation. The conversation likely started with a stern, by-the-book charge. "Sergeant, it has come to our attention that you have made an unauthorized structural modification to a United States Army M4 tank. You are aware, of course, that this is a serious breach of protocol and a court-martial offense. The military bureaucracy, a vast and powerful machine in its own right, moved to protect its own rigid structure. To this officer, Cullin's invention was a dangerous precedent. What if every sergeant with a bright idea started welding scrap metal to their tanks? The logistical and maintenance nightmare would be catastrophic. Cullin's defense was not an excuse or a stammered apology. It was a simple, powerful statement of battlefield necessity, the kind of irrefutable logic that can only be forged in the crucible of combat. He likely stood at attention, respectful but unwavering, and explained the problem with the calm clarity of an expert. He described the exposed underbellies, the stalled advances, the screaming of men trapped in burning tanks, the mounting, unsustainable casualties. And then he delivered the simple, devastating conclusion. The official way was not working. His device did. He wasn't arguing against the rules in theory. He was presenting a solution that rendered the old rules obsolete in practice. His final argument was likely simple and profound. "Sir, with all due respect, we would have lost those tanks anyway. This way, we save the crews."
The grudging vindication, the moment that turned this story from a potential court-martial into a legend, came not from the bureaucrats, but from a man who cared about results above all else. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st United States Army and the architect of the beleaguered Operation Cobra. As Bradley was visiting the front, his mood grim, wrestling with the catastrophic problem of the hedgerows that threatened to derail his entire offensive, and perhaps even the Normandy campaign, a junior officer made a courageous, career-risking decision. Major General Leroy H. Watson, commander of the 3rd Armored Division, having seen the device himself, flagged down Bradley's jeep. Risking the general's considerable wrath for the unscheduled interruption, he insisted that there was something Bradley absolutely had to see. Bradley, impatient and under immense pressure, was skeptical, but Watson's urgency was compelling. He was driven to a quiet sector where Culin and his team were waiting with their modified Sherman.
Bradley watched, his arms crossed, his face a mask of professional doubt, as the rhino-equipped tank charged a particularly nasty-looking hedgerow and tore through it with shocking, brutal efficiency. The general stood silent for a long moment, the gears turning in his strategic mind. He immediately understood. He saw not a violation of protocol, but the key, the simple, elegant, brutally effective key to unlocking the entire Normandy front. According to eyewitnesses, Bradley, a man known for his quiet, understated demeanor, turned to his aides, his eyes alight with newfound possibility, and issued a series of rapid-fire orders. He wanted to know everything about the device. Who made it? Culin was brought forward, a grease-stained sergeant standing before one of the most powerful generals in the Allied command. What did he make it from? Scavenged German roadblocks. The irony was not lost on Bradley. How fast could they make more? Bradley didn't just approve of the unauthorized invention. He seized it with the fervor of a drowning man finding a life raft. He ordered that the project be classified top secret to maintain the element of surprise. He commanded ordnance depots to be stripped, welders from every maintenance unit to be put on the round-the-clock shifts, and every available piece of scrap German steel to be collected and repurposed. The unofficial, clandestine project of one sergeant became the #1 industrial priority for the entire First Army. There was no formal punishment for Curtis Culin. His act of defiance was completely erased by its spectacular, undeniable success. The reward, when it came, was as humble and understated as the man himself. There was no grand parade, no ceremony on a reviewing stand with newspaper cameras flashing. For his ingenuity and his monumental contribution to the war effort, Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III was awarded the Legion of Merit. It was a prestigious award, one of the highest the Army could bestow for non-combat service, but it was likely handed to him at a simple field ceremony, perhaps in the same dusty tent where he had faced a potential court-martial weeks earlier. It was a quiet acknowledgement from a grateful army that his insubordination had saved an untold number of American lives and, quite possibly, the entire Normandy campaign.
The ultimate proof of Sergeant Culin's genius was not the medal pinned to his chest, but the quiet, seismic shift in military doctrine that rippled across the entire American army in Normandy. His unauthorized welding job was given an official name, Project Cooter, and its implementation was executed with the full industrial might of the United States military. A massive, frantic production effort began. Welding teams were organized and worked in shifts 24 hours a day. Naval salvage teams were brought ashore, their specialized cutting equipment repurposed from clearing sunken ships to harvesting the thousands of German steel obstacles that littered the beaches and roads. The irony was sublime. The very steel the Germans had in place to stop the Allied invasion was now being forged into the weapon that would guarantee its success. By the launch of Operation Cobra on July 25th, an astonishing logistical feat had been accomplished. Nearly 60% of the M4 Sherman and M5 Stuart tanks in the First Army had been fitted with the Culin Wino device. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and decisive. When the massive aerial bombardment that kicked off Operation Cobra concluded, the German defenders, dazed but resolute, prepared for the familiar, slow-moving American assault. Instead, they witnessed a terrifying spectacle. Hundreds of American tanks, no longer confined to roads or narrow gaps, charged forward on a broad front, ripping and tearing their way through the hedgerow defenses as if they were made of canvas. Armored divisions, once thought to be neutralized by the terrain, could now charge through the bocage, maintaining the speed, shock, and momentum that was the very soul of armored warfare. The German defensive line, so brilliantly designed to bleed a methodical advance, simply shattered. The Rhino device didn't just help the breakout, it was the steel tip of the spear that made the breakout possible. The archived testimonies from the men who used it are a chorus of awe and gratitude. An after-action report from the 2nd Armored Division, dated August 1944, noted with clinical understatement, the hedge-cutting device developed in the field proved invaluable, allowing tanks to advance with infantry and provide direct fire support in terrain previously considered impassable for armor. It significantly reduced casualties and increased the speed of the advance. A tanker from the 743rd Tank Battalion in a letter home put it more bluntly, "Dear Mary, you won't believe what they put on the front of our tank. It's got these big steel teeth like a monster from a movie. The fellas call them rhinos. We can go through these damn hedges now like they're made of paper. The Krauts don't know what hit them. For the first time in a month, I feel like we're the ones doing the hunting. The guy who came up with that deserves a medal the size of a dinner plate." After the war, after the victory parades and the triumphant return home, Curtis Culin returned to his quiet civilian life. He went back to Cranford, New Jersey, a humble hero who had turned the tide of a pivotal campaign and then simply went home. He sought no fame, gave few interviews, and lived the rest of his life far from the spotlight, a testament to the quiet professionalism that had defined his service. He went back to the world of garages and engines, a world he understood. His neighbors, the people he saw every day, likely had no idea that the unassuming man who sold them a new set of tires had once held the fate of an entire military operation in his grease-stained hands. He was a man who saw a problem, understood its mechanics, and built a solution, not for glory, not for promotion, but because it was the right and logical thing to do.
But perhaps the most powerful insight into his motivation, into the mind of this unsung genius, comes not from military records or the praise of generals, but from the quiet reflections of the man himself, long after the sounds of battle had faded into memory. In a rare late-life interview for a local historical society, he was asked why. Why did he risk a court-martial? Why did he defy the system to build his device? His answer was devoid of bravado or self-aggrandizement. It was the simple, profound logic of a man who valued lives over rules. A mechanic who saw a fatal design flaw, not in a machine, but in a plan. He explained, in his own plain words, the impossible choice they faced every day in the hedgerows. The sheer, pointless waste of life in trying to follow a plan that was clearly failing. And then he delivered the core of his reasoning, the elegant and simple thesis of his genius. "It just seemed so simple," he said. "You could see the problem right in front of you. You saw good men dying for no good reason. There was a problem, and there had to be a better way than the one we were using. The men were dying, and the tanks were just getting stuck, becoming targets. I didn't think about rules or regulations. I just figured there had to be a way to fix the machine, to give those boys a fighting chance. That's all it was." And maybe that's the real lesson of the Culin Rhino. That the most powerful weapon in any army isn't a tank or a cannon, but the ingenuity of a single soldier who refuses to accept that a problem is impossible. That sometimes history doesn't remember you for the orders you followed, but for the one you had the courage to break. The story of Curtis Culin is a powerful reminder of the countless unsung heroes of World War II, whose ingenuity on the battlefield had an impact as profound as any general's strategy. If you want to learn more about the incredible innovations and the brave individuals who changed the course of the war, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Explained and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. And let us know in the comments below about other unsung geniuses you think deserve to have their stories told.
Thank you for watching.